That was a song called Cannonball, and I'll do one for you called Love in a Hurricane. Oh, almost forgot the key ingredient here. The drums. Well, they met out in Odessa many years ago. She was just a baby, Mama told her so. She Mama, don't you worry, 'cause I'm old enough to see just how much I love him and how much he loves me. And all these words I'm saying simply can't explain how we just fell in love like a hurricane. So then moved on out to Houston, right big city lights. He would be her husband, and she would be his wife. They would have a family in a house out west of town. Pick each other up and laugh and knock them down. Some folks live their lives like they're walking through the rain. Let's live ours, making love in the hurricane. Years pass by so quickly. The kids are grown and gone. We still have each other. Work's still to be done. Now as I lay down beside you, you lay beside me. The storms outside still raging, and it will always be. But I will always love you. So go turn out the light, put your arms around me, and let's make love tonight. Because some folks live their lives like they're walking through the rain. We live ours, making love in the hurricane. We were making love in a hurricane. Storms and light will come and go, the silence and the pain. The trick is making love in the hurricane. Thank you. Yes, that's correct. Facebook right now, and then I'm also doing Twitch. I'm not quite doing YouTube yet, but every Thursday at 6 p.m. Central on Facebook for sure. Thank you. My pleasure.
Hi, everybody. Cool. I'm gonna share my screen because I got a whole presentation ready to roll. Let me see here. All right. I hope y'all can see that. Cool. Hi. Thanks for having me. My name is Jason. I'm here to talk to you about a lot of history stuff. primarily sort of the sanitization of nonviolence, how nonviolence has been portrayed in kind of history books. We'll get there. I'm actually going to start somewhere else. I'm going to start with someone who's near and dear to my heart, and I think, hopefully many of yours, Joan of Arc. So Joan of Arc is a story that I think we all learned about in school. A 19-year-old girl comes from the far reaches of France and leads their armies to victory, sort of ends the 100-year war, kicks the British out of France. Hooray, this is historical. It's actually happened. It's an amazing story. It also makes no sense whatsoever. Who in their right mind would let the 19-year-old girl in to see the King of France, let alone put her in charge of the army? The answer to this actually makes the entire story make a whole lot more sense, even though it's not often put into sort of how our story is told. The answer is Yolande of Aragon, who was the King of France's mother-in-law, the King of France at the time being Charles VII. Yolande of Aragon is one of these figures in history who's like kind of little known. She, best we can tell, kind of operated in the shadows kind of person. So there's a lot of details of her life where it's like, but best we can tell, this is the going theory. There's obviously many of them because history, but this is the one that I find most likely. She had an army ready to roll to kick out the British. Again, this has been going on for about 100 years at this point. This fight, and she had a son-in-law armies, except he was extremely dispirited. He's just like, oh, I can't do anything. I just need a sign from God. And so she made one. She was in charge of a region of France that was known for its minstrels, its bards, and so very mysteriously, around this time, this legend started popping up with all the bards singing it about how there was going to be some girl coming from the far reaches of France, a peasant girl who was going to lead them to victory. About 35 girls showed up. She changed Joan. The whole thing was basically like the 14th century help wanted ad. So all this makes this make a lot more sense. But the thing that it still doesn't quite get to in all of this is the character of Joan of Arc herself, who I think generally is portrayed in a lot of the history books, at least the way I learned about it, was a little sanitized. In reality, she was kind of a brutal warlord that everybody was kind of terrified of. She was really good at cannon warfare. And that sort of gets left out of a lot of the portrayals of her. Like, the people would surrender rather than go up to her in battle because she was just terrifying to them. So I really like that sort of twin aspect of like her being this holy, sort of revered martyr figure, but also a terrifying warlord. So I, in my work, sort of marry these sorts of very incongruous concepts. So I illustrated her as this is sort of like, what if she was a Disney princess, right? And there's some of the angels that she's purported to have seen in her life, and there's Yolande of Aragon there hanging out in the background. This is the sort of work that I do under the heading of Rejected Princesses. It's where I gather women that you haven't heard of, or if you have heard of them, there's stuff that you really don't know but should about them, that sort of fleshes them out as people. It's not like purely good, purely bad, but like an interesting mix of all of the above. Some of the people that I have here is Mochizuki Chiyome, who is a Japanese woman who, kindly old lady who ran an orphanage for the time of war. There were a lot of widows and prostitutes, orphans. So she took all of them in and made it into a secret ninja academy and had like the largest spy army in possibly the world at the time. Rani Lakshmibai, who we'll get to later in this, but led an armed uprising against the British in India in 1857 with a baby strapped to her back. Joan of Arc, and then Ana Lizana de Arinza, who semi-mythical Bolivian lesbian teenage vigilante, kind of Batman, basically. Anyways, this is the project I do, but it's not what I've always done. Prior to doing princesses, I worked at DreamWorks. I was not a animator as people would generally think of them. I would like draw stuff. I was like a physics animator. I would do like all the liquid simulations. Like this is a shot from the end of Shrek 4, I think. where they were like moving a lot of mud, and I had to do all the physics calculations for that. So it was a very strange kind of animator. I didn't know how to draw. I kind of taught myself over my time there. And all that kind of started shifting when this movie came out. When Frozen came out, it kind of sucked all the air out of the room. It's all anybody could talk about. Every website out there was putting up different articles because people would click on them. So there were tons of articles sort of being passed around work here and there about this. But one that really like stuck with us was one of those 12 reasons the Frozen girls are bad role models or something like that. And so I brought it up at lunch, and we basically just shot the shit. We're like, if they're bad role models, we can come up with way worse ones. Like, what's the worst idea for a Disney princess you can think of? And at that lunch table meeting, we were just trying to one-up each other. The worst one we came up with was Nabokov's Lolita as a Disney princess, which is a truly terrible idea. It made me laugh, but it's a truly terrible idea. But some of the ones that I tossed out there were just like a Wikipedia junkie, and God, there we go. I would toss out ones that nobody at the table had heard of, like Boudicca, who is a first century proto-Celtic woman who, when her husband was killed and her daughters were ravaged, she led a force against the Romans that ended up killing 70 to 80,000 Romans and burning what would become London to the ground. It was a town called Londinium at the time. Or Jingumbande, who's credited as the mother of Angola, led a guerrilla warfare campaign against the Portuguese for 35 to 40 years. Just a fierce, amazing human being. Nobody at the table had heard of them. So I was just like, oh, wouldn't it be cool? But I went back to work. It wasn't until the last movie that I worked on there that I really started shifting my point of view on this a lot. And that was How to Train Your Dragon 2. Spoilers for anybody who hasn't seen it. I'm sorry, I'm about to spoil a several years old movie at this point. But so the How to Train Your Dragon franchise, at the time there was just the one, and we were working on the second. But far and away the most popular character to cosplay, at least from the first one, was Astrid, the sort of love interest Viking who is portrayed. The first shot she shows up in, she's walking away from an explosion. She's the most competent character there, right? And in the second one, she gets relegated to this sort of girlfriend role. This upset me. This upset me a lot because it was sort of like shifting away from like a more nuanced, interesting look at her, and she just becomes sort of this Baudelaireized character. But what upset me more was the portrayal of a new character whose name was Velka, who's the long lost missing mom of the main character. The way that Velka was portrayed shifted throughout production, and that with it shifted the entire tone of the movie. The movie as was released was different than the movie as it was conceived. The movie as it was originally conceived was Empire Strikes Back. Now, follow me here. Both characters have lightsabers. They are missing limbs and have artificial ones that they put together themselves. In the first one, they blow up the Death Star. In the second one, they blow up a nearly identical Death Star. Characters ride X-Wings. Luke, I am your mother. She was supposed to be Darth Vader. She was not. If you've seen the movie or the third one, you'll know that she shows up and there's a little bit of like confusion, maybe like 5 minutes of hurt feelings of like, hey, where have you been for the past 18 years? But then she's just a genuinely good character, and they never get into it. She never gets any of the emotional depth or the complexity that you get with a Darth Vader. And I went to the heads of the studio. I'm like, she was so much more interesting when she was this Jane Goodall eco-terrorist that wants to free all the dragons, and you had legitimate conflict. Why did we have to change that? And they're just like, we didn't think it would test well with moms. We wanted something that was more simple to digest. It's a kid's movie. We just want generic good and evil, generic good and evil. It's just easier this way. And that upset me. And I was already planning to leave the studio, but I did after that movie. And a lot of what I did in the wake of that, this was sort of inspired by that, was doing this Rejected Princesses thing where I dive into the stories of historical women. But as I started doing this, and I am not a historian by training, I again was sort of a physics programmer. I really wanted to dive into these characteristics that I saw time and time again, kind of simplified, censored, just put into camps of good and evil. I really wanted to dive into stuff that I felt was missing from history class, that like history class would be really boring, of like it's just facts and figures, and like the people are not relatable. They're like these ivory tower people. So I'd look into it and try and portray them in all the good, the bad, and the ugly. So you'd take someone like Harriet Tubman, and at the time Harriet Tubman was sort of just this portrayed as this kindly lady who freed people from slavery. It wasn't until drunk history rolled around, I would argue, that people started seeing her as like, no, she was an arsonist spy master for the Union. There's actually a story that it's impossible to verify, but it shows up in a couple of the biographies of her, where she's not, the reason that you never see her smiling in any of her photos, such the biography claims, is that she doesn't have any front teeth. And she doesn't have any front teeth because at one point on one of her missions, she had a mouth infection. And instead of endangering the mission by going in to get it fixed, she took the back end of her gun and knocked out her own teeth, which is just nuts. That is not the image of Harriet Tubman that I grew up with. That is some action hero stuff. And like, she's got good and bad. She definitely like had some great like out there visions, and like she was a more complex character than I was getting portrayed. Similarly, Amelia Earhart, aviatrix, daredevil, amazing human being. Also, polyamorous libertine who is in an open marriage. Her contract with her husband basically said, look, I'm going to try and be faithful, but let's be honest, I'm Amelia Earhart and you're Amelia Earhart's husband, so it might not happen. But the one that got me more than any of them was Helen Keller. Helen Keller is what one of my friends referred to as inspiration porn, especially as portrayed by like the Disney versions or the miracle worker and whatnot. It's just, here's an inspirational story of someone overcoming adversity, yada, yada, yada. And it cuts off like before she becomes an adult. So you get this version of Helen Keller. You don't get this version of Helen Keller, because when she became an adult, she became an outspoken activist, socialist, arguably communist, and did not mince words. Like she was not a fan of war. She was definitely leftist and outspoken, and basically they wanted her to get talk. Like they were very into her when she was starting to talk, and then when she started talking, they just wanted her to shut up. She would show up to protests and whatnot, and like this is just not the picture of her that I got in my books. It was this very slim sliver of like, oh, she's a good person, and like there's no depth to her, there's no complexity. And similarly, like a lot of these, I started seeing that a lot of these movements also had similar ways of being portrayed. So she was big into sort of women's suffrage and then labor stuff. And the image of the suffrage movement, I think that largely I got, at least in school, and I think the way that it's largely portrayed are these women with the signs and the purple sashes, and it's very like wave for the camera, when in reality it was rightly kind of two movements. This right here is sort of the US movement, the suffragists. The UK movement, which had this definitely the sort of peaceful wave for the camera, also I think was more notably had the suffragettes, who were, I think it is fair to say, homegrown terrorists. They would bomb things, they would fight the cops, like literally they had their own version of jiu-jitsu that they learned to do called suffragitsu. They would carry around billy clubs and get into tussles with the police. There's a woman named Edith Garrod who trained a 30-woman strong bodyguard squad for Emmeline Pankhurst, who was sort of the head of their group. So she had what they called Pankers Amazons, I think is what they called them. And the news media at the time was kind of a Twitter about them, is like afraid, like portraying them in tremendously unfavorable terms, understandably. But that sort of thing gets whittled down, censored. So you have like the suffragists, who are the good ones, and then you have the suffragettes, who are the bad ones, and you sort of leave it at that, and you don't go into the complexity of like, well, why were these people doing like the suffragettes were rare. They would never like pick a fight with the cops. They would fight in defense. They would destroy property, but they wouldn't instigate violence. Why were they doing this? Well, there was like their treatment when they were speaking out and they were doing these sort of nonviolent protests were horrifying. It radicalized them. They would be force-fed. They would be beaten. They would be imprisoned. They would be put into mental asylums that were like tremendously unsanitary, and nobody really cared. And so it radicalized a lot of them, and they're just like, we're not playing by these rules anymore. Emmeline Pankhurst was actually famous for going around, she would do, whenever she was in prison a lot, she would do these combination hunger, sleep, and thirst strikes, where she just wouldn't eat or drink anything. She would wander around with her arm above her head so that she wouldn't be able to fall asleep. The WSPU, was the group that she was with, actually had its own ambulance to transport her around. And yet, a lot of the way that the movements were portrayed was, you have the good ones who are nice, nonviolent, and prim and proper, wait for the camera, and then you have the violent ones who just are these shrews that are constantly demanding more and more and more. They're often portrayed as kind of ugly. They're it was shall we say, uncharitable interpretations. And you see this with other social movements as well. You have Gandhi. Gandhi's the good one. The bad one is Rani Lakshmibai, or any of the many decades, arguably a century, of armed rebellion against the British government that came beforehand. That's the bad one, and Gandhi's the good one. But at the time, Gandhi was portrayed as part and parcel of that. It wasn't necessarily portrayed as there was this distinction, right? And it was constantly like he was being tarred with this implication of violence, right? So you have your political cartoon where India, the entire nation itself, is portrayed as this woman that's holding a child and is at danger, and everybody else is just blithely leaving her to violence, which is sort of thought to be, okay, this is the natural state. This is like they're knocking down all of the order, and this is what it's going to descend into. You see this over and over again. It's like that is constantly like tarring these nonviolent movements that now we see as like legitimate and like saintly, but they're like, oh no, they're violent. You don't know what they're going to lead to. Martin Luther King Jr. is a very direct line to that. Like you can see him there with the portrait of Gandhi. That is very intentional on his part. But then he's the sort of flip side here is he's the good one, and Malcolm X is the bad one. When in reality, they were kind of, you can't have one without the other. And here's where I'm going out on a little bit of a limb here, right? I do a lot of deep dives into history. I'm not like a historian by training. I don't have like the broad like study absolutely everything. I do like, here's an interesting person, I'm going to dive deep on this, dive deep on that, dive deep on that. So this is basically my thinking from having done a ton of deep dives, enough deep dives, and like follow different rabbit holes where they lead to come to this idea that, and this is just something I'm tossing out there, but I believe this is true, that nonviolent movements usually are not successful unless there is a violent movement attached to them. When you have purely nonviolent movements, oftentimes they're quashed by sort of authoritarian things and whatnot. The violent part of these movements are part and parcel of it to make the nonviolent one the good one by being the bad one. And the Malcolm X school of thought, the Black Panthers were unambiguously at the time the bad one. I think to this day are sort of considered the bad one. Like in I think this is 1857, the Black Panthers went into the state capitol at Sacramento and just stood there with guns, just saying, "Hey, we're here. We have guns." And people were freaked out and passed gun legislation pretty much immediately after. Like people were legit scared of them in the same way that people were legit scared of the suffragettes, legit scared of other stuff. So it made King look better, but even at the time, there was a lot of attempt to say no, they're part and parcel of the same thing, like, and tie him to it. It's just like, oh, they're ignoring him. They you can see these cartoons where you have, it's like, oh yeah, he's preaching nonviolence, but he's not. It's blithely ignoring what the reality of it is. Like it's which is not. I don't think how it's seen historically, but at the time, people were trying to kind of paint him with that brush. You can see it in this cartoon, right? It's like, I plan to lead another nonviolent march tomorrow. Like, I don't know about you, but this feels like a really contemporary cartoon to me. Like, I could see something like this. You swap out like who is standing there in place of MLK. That could be in the paper today, right? And like this is like I did some digging on this and found out that people actually sent him this and like scribbled on this. It's hard to read, so I wrote up there. This is best I could tell. Is how can you, a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ, be such a deceitful hypocrite? You're not fooling anyone but yourself, and you're nauseating talk about nonviolence. You demand a program to overcome poverty and blow in untold amounts in your high living and running all over the globe to feed your own egotism. That feels really contemporary to me, right? And it feels like there's no separation, there's no understanding of the complexity of the situation. Everything is just good or bad, and you paint them with one brush or the other. And there were concerted efforts to tie him to things that other people wouldn't like. When like it became more evident that his message of civil rights was really picking up and getting more press, and people were generally in favor of it, he was starting to get tied to anti-Vietnam stuff, which was less popular. So like, in the same way that like I see echoes of this of like, oh, Black Lives Matter, tying it to like being a Marxist organization, right? Like they're kind of not the same thing, but you get them sort of mixed in. Like it feels like these are just echoes of things happening throughout. Let me go to the next slide. And I see this like with social movements and revolutions all over. Like the gay rights movement had to have Stonewall. Like it was there before, but Stonewall really picked it up. And yes, I cover Marsha P. Johnson in one of my books. The Egyptian revolution in 1919, this is largely seen as a nonviolent revolution. However, there was a largely violent component that was put down by sort of World War troops from, weirdly enough, Australia was a lot of the troops that were doing it. They just happened to be there at the time. Tobago and Trinidad are viewed as kind of a nonviolent emancipation of like how they freed the slaves. Like they petitioned for it, and they got their freedom. It's great, but that kind of ignores the decades of violent revolts that led to that, like decades and decades and decades of this. That made it the more palatable alternative, that you were able to separate like, oh, that's the good one, that's the bad one. But Trinidad and Tobago remember this. They remember both sides of it. They celebrate both sides of that. That's a reenactment on the right. To my understanding, they do this on the regular as part of their Emancipation Day celebrations, so that they remember both sides in the same way that we would remember, like in the States, like the war for independence, right? They wrestle with both sides of it. Not every country wrestles with absolutely everything, but I would argue that there's a lack of wrestling with certain parts of the American past and just portraying them as just good or bad. And like all countries do this, to be sure, it's not serving us particularly well. Similarly, you have Korea. That's the March 1st movement. This was the one of possibly the first big nonviolent movement. It actually inspired Gandhi. They were trying to get the Japanese out when the Japanese had basically invaded and were running Korea. And there was largely nonviolent movement to that. And that's what a lot of the history books remember. But Korea also remembers all the violent uprisings, all the guerrilla warfare and the fights that they had. This is a fairly big budget movie that came out just last year that's about one of those fights. And yes, it's easy to have like that when you have a enemy that is another nation, but still remembering both sides of how things went, I think is important. Where I think a lot of this like comes down to the changing point for how we were remembering a lot of this stuff. The one that stands out to me, at least, there are a lot of them, but the labor movement. I mean, this is coming right before Labor Day, so it's on my mind. But I think the way that I got it growing up, and the way I think a lot of us got it growing up, were these images of the labor movement being people going on strike and holding up signs and whatever, and it sort of ignores a lot of the like bigger moments of it, like the Haymarket riots, which I learned about in passing, but I didn't really understand the full scale of like police brutality and the protesters bombing things, assassinations. Like it was crazy, the scale of people going to court and being run through kangaroo courts and whatnot. Like it's a messy, complicated thing where there's not a lot of like necessarily good people that people get radicalized. It's an important moment in U.S. history that's sort of given usually good versus evil, like World War II or World War I, right? Similarly, like the Ludlow Massacre, which I never heard about in school, is this huge moment in U.S. labor history where the Rockefeller and I believe in concert with the National Guard go in and just kill a bunch of strikers, including women and children, in this tent city, which to me evokes like all of these images of like where people are setting up little tent cities for protests, even nowadays, like Occupy Wall Street or whatever. They go in and they literally kill all of them. And it's well, not all of them, but like a good 20 some odd, and it really turns the tide of opinion against them. What changes about this afterwards is that Rockefeller sees the tide of opinion turning against him, and this is again like around 100 years ago, and he hires a dude named Ivy Lee, who kind of makes the first stab at modern PR. And so there's a lot of pictures of Rockefeller going around handing out dimes to kids in the wake of this to sort of rehabilitate his image and like look at him being a nice dude who gives back to the community, etc. Like this is a tactic, and it evolved and it changed form, and you start seeing what works and what doesn't, and the stories start changing. And it's not like the Ludlow Massacre had a ton of nuance to the reporting as it was, but you know, it was at least getting out that side, and then people were able to argue the other side. But you start seeing things that again feel fairly contemporary, just like one-sided, like look at all this property violence, look at all this, whereas like just a scant like a couple of years before, it was you'd see the sides of the strikers as well. It becomes like you're separating things out into good and bad, and you're losing all of the middle ground, and you're not seeing sort of where people are coming from. And I just see this more and more and more, like people are like the PR sort of evolved from newspaper articles down to memes that can be shared everywhere, and everything gets just boiled down into its most like emotional yellow journalism components, and it's not great to see. I'd much rather that we have deeper dives and looks into people with all their messy complexity, and see what they were fighting for and why they were the way they were, and all the stuff that they did that was good and bad and rate them on that as opposed to just lumping them in as this is the good one, this is the bad one. Anyways, that's what my work is about. I hope you enjoyed. I hope I didn't go too far out on a limb there. Thanks for listening. Let me stop sharing my screen if I can figure out where my mouse is. I cannot figure out where my mouse is. There we are. Thank you.
One second. We will shortly. Yes. Alright, let's go live on YouTube and we'll be ready to go. Okay, let me go live on Facebook.
My reaction to that is like, yes, when you say non-intuitive methods, and I would characterize the sort of the fire hoses and whatnot as being the underdog. I think that there's a race to be the underdog, kind of on all sides, to be the one that is put upon and the one that is fighting against the tyranny or what have you. I think that was what has traditionally been very effective in swaying public opinion. I would argue more so than appeals to love and whatnot, because if you have that, then hippies would be running the world, and yeah. Like Marianne Williamson would be topping the polls.
Can I make a comment? May I make a comment? One thing that is currently happening is that there's that nonviolent protests are starting to get a really bad image, mixed up with the bad stuff. And I don't know what's going on, but it's certainly worth watching carefully. And the other thing that I have been thinking about for a long time is that the ease with which, friends and family, everybody says, "Oh, you don't like something? Well, you have a chance to vote, next time," which is a long time between disgruntlement, and disagreement with what's currently going on. Those are two separate ideas. But the idea that, well, sure we have a way to solve these problems. All you have to do is wait and sign up and vote when the time comes.
I mean, I agree. Yeah, I believe it to be, like, in my point of view, it is a PR tactic to tar current nonviolent protests with the same brush as the violent ones. And I think it's the same thing that you saw with MLK. It's the same thing you've seen kind of all over. And I if I had to draw a line historically, I'd draw it back to Rockefeller and the birth of modern PR, to where everything just sort of, you don't get any sort of distinction. Everything is good or bad, and when you're not splitting them into two, and you're just painting everything with the bad brush, then that's what you get. That's my point of view, at least.
Hi there, Jason. Good morning, and thank you for a magnificent presentation. We want to hear so much more from you. I really appreciated you pulling the balance thread of the violent, nonviolent internationally, because America is certainly not the only seed with violent, nonviolent, right? But you're a student of history more than I am. So I'd like you possibly to maybe go back in history and see where these things have brought their societies. And in essence, I'm asking of you to look at the history and then what do you see in the future of the United States given those historical seed parameters?
Okay. I'll first address your what I think you were getting at with some of the international stuff. There are instances in other countries and other cultures where what would, at least from a historical perspective, seem to be purely nonviolent movements were successful. These were largely civilizations and cultures that were non-Western, or were. So I'm primarily thinking of Africa, actually. Like it's primarily when I think of this, I think of a woman named Nwanyirua. I'm probably mispronouncing the name. I've only ever seen it written. Who started what it was referred to as the Abbas Women's Riot or the Igbo Women's War, which was a protestation against taxation that was nonviolent and successful. Similarly, Ransom Kuti, who's the mother of Fela Kuti, the musician. I think that's what she's best known for nowadays, but honestly is on a global scale the equal of any MLK or Gandhi. Nonviolent protester who inspired a wave of such movements across Africa. Also, like, was successful, and you see this also a little bit with New Zealand. And New Zealand, there were holdings. This is my understanding, and I'm going a little bit out on memory, so I could have some of the details wrong on this. That Samoa agitated for independence, and the New Zealand part of it, the New Zealand controlled part of Samoa, is like, well argued. We see what you're saying. Go forth and be independent. The American side brought in Hawaiian folk to basically sway opinion and muddy the waters. Hawaii having just sort of lost its movement for independence in the U.S. And so there's what continues to be American Samoa. So I don't know. I have trouble not knowing enough about like the cultural characteristics of those cultures to draw a line of like, this is the lever that is different between those. If I had to guess, it would be something related to sort of cultural shame and cultural like the lever of shame too. But I don't know. That's me going way out on a limb. As for trajectory of the U.S., not great. Yeah, I don't think in good places. I'm sorry.
Tell me more.
I'm just gonna get real depressed.
No, I was just thinking that what we're doing here is a good example of social evolution. Seeing things that we believe to be true and seeing the truth of it now. I mean, it's how we progress, and that's just a comment I made. I was thinking. That's it.
My question is part comment, but people forget I'm old. And I was in Chicago as an adult for the Martin Luther King riots, the ones that followed his assassination. And I am of the opinion and also have a question. I think it takes violence to get through the nonviolent movement, to get people's attention. In every case that I remember, and look at what's happening in Belarus today. Are you following that, Jason?
A little bit.
Yeah. They have a nonviolent protest, but it was the violence against the protesters that's got the international attention. So I think they're hand in glove. And I sort of picked that up about your talk. Is that true? Yeah, I pick it up correctly.
I mean, I preface it in the talk of like, this is me going out a little bit on a limb. Like, I do deep dives as opposed to a broad overview of history, broad survey. I tend to agree, because the violent stuff lets the nonviolence be the palatable alternative. When you have a nonviolent protest with no violent component, it can be quashed, and often is, or is overshadowed. Like, when you don't address the nonviolent component, don't say, okay, we're going to canonize this. This is a good one. If you're in cases where they're all castigated as bad and quashed, it leads to really like autocratic like stuff like the Arab Spring, where there were a lot of nonviolent protests, but then they kept getting crushed, and it radicalized everybody and turned them all violent, which is very bad. I believe that in most cases, at least in Western countries that I have studied, having a violent component to a movement to allow the nonviolent component to be the palatable alternative is a key component. There are isolated instances where that's not the case, but I would argue there are exceptions to the rule.
Thank you.
I mean, it certainly help. Yeah, I mean, it's not the only thing for sure, but it's certainly, I don't know, it feels to me, and again, this is like personal thought going out on limbs, it feels to me like this oversimplification is this sort of childish thinking where everything kind of gets boiled down to this common denominator that can make it across like a wide spectrum of people that can hit the widest possible audience, as opposed to something with more nuance that slowly over time the nuance has been kind of baked out of like the popular discourse, and media and whatnot, and that's a shame. It feels like we're like all movies are aimed at the PG-13 crowd, and all media is kind of like it never gets to a higher echelon of discussion. Maybe that's an old man, but that's sort of where my mind is on that. absolutely. At the time, the Boston Tea Party, I'm sure, was not exactly heralded as a wonderful thing in gazettes and overseas and whatnot. It was probably like, oh my God, look at those violent colonials. It really is a long view of history, and you start seeing where it bends. I already stepped away in 2014 to DreamWorks and Son. Producers, there's always people who want to do this. That's the thing. It's like Hollywood is full of people with like good hearts, good intentions, etc. But getting things made is hellish. Like it takes forever. I sold the film TV rights to a very major name person who I firmly believe in their ability to get things made 2.5-3 years ago, and nothing has come of it. They haven't tried. And I got no leverage there. So when the one thing that I know more than anything is that when one movie does well, there's going to be a million movies that copy it. So when I was working on Dragons 2, right, one of the things that I railed against was at the end of the movie, Hiccup, the main character, the dude is made chief, and it's just the wrong move. He should not have been chief. It should have been Astrid. 100%. Everybody on the production agreed. We were told girls can't be chiefs. It's a boys' movie. It's an action movie. Like literally, this is the words I got from the bean counter. I think the next year Moana came out. And Moana did really great. And Moana is like this. Moana was a bet. Moana was not a safe movie for them to make. It is a all brown person cast, entirely earth palette tones, going up like I think same opening weekend against Trolls, which is like a bubblegum rainbow nightmare, and like it was a songs in a language that like 10,000 people on Earth speak. It was very like no cultural touch base. Like it was a risky movie for them to make. And the main character was a woman who unambiguously was chief, and it was just like, oh no, that's just how it is, and nobody gave a shit. And Moana did really well, and so you start seeing that pick up more and more. So when one historical movie does well, there will be more that follow. Problem is that a lot of these historical movies are terrible. There was one that came out a little bit ago called Suffragette that I really wanted to be good because, like, oh my god, it was finally like dealing with like how hardcore the suffragette movement was, and it was it wasn't good. It was like a B- movie. It didn't get into like the real nitty gritty of it. It had Meryl Streep as Emmeline Pankhurst and screwed that up. How can you screw that up? Oh, it's so mad. There's people that want to get it made. The key to get made is just for anything that is similar that the bean counters would just look at as like, oh, well, it's the same genre and it's the same whatever. Like when they feed it into the machine, it will be similar enough to be like, oh, well, that was successful. I'll also make this one. So if you want to see more historical movies, see more, like pay to see the historical movies when they come out.
road. Money in your pocket, but nowhere left to go. You gotta lay low, keep your head down. Hide out where there's no one else around. Keep playing the dice, wanna keep rolling. Gamble with the gold, you're stolen. Boys on the trail, oh. Dreams of capture haunt you just like a hungry ghost. Smack you home, didn't mean to hurt no one. Now you're counting down the days like the bullets in your gut. And off in the distance, the bell is tolling, sounding for the lives you have stolen. Well, well, yeah. Flying through the air, all the bullets ain't got you. Like the hand of the devil, reaching out to touch you. It's all over now, they're staring at the sky. There's a single tear trickle from the corner of your eye. Off in the distance, the bell is tolling. Everything you had has been stolen. On up the street, yeah, they're strolling. Now the life you had has been stolen.